Resuming debate on the budget, the honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased to be sharing my time with the member from Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, who I'm sure will happily rise and comment about how proud he is to represent people from his riding. Now, after 20 minutes of absolute fiction from the members from Winnipeg North, I thought I would continue with a bit of fiction that describes so well C-59 and Liberal financing. It's from Hemingway from The Sun Also Rises. It goes, "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. "Two ways," said Mike, "gradually and suddenly." And that is exactly this Liberal government. Another great line, which is not fiction. I wish it was fiction, but it wasn't. It's actually from the Prime Minister himself. Great line, the budget will balance itself. Does everyone remember that? Now, what do we get with the Liberal Prime Minister saying the budget will balance itself? Well, we end up with $1.4 trillion in debt. That's $93,000 for every single household in Canada. $3,400 per year per household just for interest on the Liberal debt. And you think about like the GST, 5% on everything purchased. You go out to a restaurant, you have a beer, you go to a Blue Jay game, or you perhaps go to the Edmonton Oilers game, not the Vancouver Canuck game because they're gone, but you could go to the Edmonton Oilers game. You pay 5% tax on the ticket. This year, we expect the GST is going to raise about $52 billion. Every single penny, the equivalent of every single penny of the GST collected is going to go solely to the interest on the debt. Not toward health care, not toward any of the fantasy things the member from Winnipeg North brings up, just for interest. The interest on the debt next year is going to be so bad, the GST will actually have to rise to almost 6% just to cover the interest. Now, that's more than we give to health care to the provinces, more than we give to defense. And over the next 5 years of the budget, it's going to be $338 billion of interest payments. $338 billion. Now, do you remember the Prime Minister also famously saying, when questioned about interest costs, condescendingly saying to Glenn McGregor, "Interest rates are at a historic low, Glenn." Remember that? Well, guess what? Interest rates are not at a historic low. And the Liberals, when they actually had a chance to lock in those interest rates that supposedly were at the historic low, didn't. They actually borrowed vast sums, almost $500 billion on short-term basis. And this debt is coming due, and they're going to have to refinance. So instead of paying 0.25% on that $454 billion, it's going to be a lot more. Billions added every year just in interest. Now, can you imagine you're buying a house and you're at the bank and you're negotiating a mortgage, and the bank's telling you, "Hey, we've got all-time low for interest rates, and you can lock in for a long time at 1%. And you say, "You know what? No, I'm going to roll the dice because I don't think they're going to go up." And then, boom, all of a sudden you'd end up with a 5-year or 5, 6, 7, 8% when you renew. You wouldn't do that. No one would be foolish enough to do that. But that's what the Liberal government has done. They've just basically said, "No, we don't want long-term locked in. We're going to roll the dice." And what happens? We end up with massive increases. So what could we actually buy with that $338 billion that this government's going to pay just for interest rate or interest costs alone over the next 5 years? Well, the government could buy 5,600 ArriveCan apps, not at the $80,000 that it was originally going to be, but at the $60 million that this government paid for. They could buy 17,000 contracts to GC Strategies to develop apps and not actually do any work on. They could do 500,000 studies from contractors such as KPMG to advise the government on how to cut back on contracts from the government. this government famously paid KPMG $670,000 to provide advice on how to cut back contracts to people like KPMG. They could buy 42,000 luxury barns, like the $8 million barn they put up at the Governor General's property. Now, do you remember the Liberal cabinet spending $1.3 million on 3 luxury getaways to talk about the affordability crisis? They could actually afford 260,000 of their luxury getaways to discuss the affordability crisis. They could buy 37 million nights at the $9,000 a night luxury plaza that the Prime Minister took for his Christmas vacation, but, you know, just staying with friends like every other Canadian. Now, I say some of these things just to show how ridiculous that this spending is. But in real terms, we could actually build, with that $338 billion just on interest, we could build a new hospital for the largest 100 cities in Canada. So basically every city above 35,000 people, we could actually build a brand new $3.5 billion hospital. We could actually increase healthcare transfers to the provinces by about 700%. We could buy 482,000 houses across the country at the current average house price of $700,000. Instead, it's going to interest. But that's okay, the budget will balance itself. And Glenn, interest rates are at historic lows. We don't have to worry about it. And we could actually afford 800% of the current outlay of all Canadians are paying on pharmaceuticals. Not a fake pharmacare plan that the Liberal government is saying of contraceptives and diabetic. That's not pharmacare, that's 2 items. 2 items. The government could actually pay for everything with just 12% of what they're paying on interest right now. Now, I want to get to C-59 itself, the fall economic statement. Just a couple quick items from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. And he talks, this is from his highlights. He says, revisions to the economic outlook and fiscal developments lowered the outlook for the budgetary balance by $19 billion. So the PBO is saying things are getting worse by $19 billion. Government's announced $23 billion in new spending that was partially offset by $3 billion in refocusing. So lots of added spending. Fall economic statement claims to expand the budget commitment to refocus government spending with the goal to identify additional $2.4 billion in savings over a 4-year period. Now that's out of $465 billion a year in revenues, and about $500 billion a year and costs over about a $2.5 trillion spending budget over the 5 years. They're going to save $2 billion, including $500 million this year, even though it's money that they're saying now is not needed, but went through the Treasury Board process as needed. He continues, there's currently little info available on the status of the $15 billion in spending reviews and savings announced by the government. Further, there is currently no publicly available information related to the $3.6 billion spending to be reallocated in 2023-2024. Now, one of the things the government has promised to cut back on in this $3 billion is outside consulting. Now, of course, if you remember in 2015, the member of Winnipeg North, I'm sure will tell you, they promised to cut back on outside contracting, consulting. What's happened instead is ballooned to $21 billion, including, as I mentioned, $670,000 to KPMG to advise the government on how to actually stop spending so much money on companies like KPMG. A couple of my other favorites that they spent money on with outside contracting, they gave Deloitte $250,000 to give a 4-page report saying don't buy sophisticated IT security equipment from despotic regimes. They paid $250,000 also to Deloitte for a fairness study on an RFP for a security contract for something that they sole sourced out under government policy. 50,000 people in public services whose job is to make sure the contracts are fair, but they decided they had to give money to Deloitte. Mr. Speaker, it's clear the government has no clue what they're doing with the economy. It's clear they have no clue what they're doing with the budget. The budgets will not balance themselves. The Conservative government, however, will.